Today I'm going to talk about the fake simplicity of atheism.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
So when I talk about the fake simplicity of atheism, what I mean is that proponents of atheism will tend to describe it as, well, this is just simpler. It's like what you believe, except without that pesky God concept. You'll hear the same thing, by the way, applied to naturalism, which is just rebranded materialism. Materialism being the belief that all that exists is matter and its interactions. When that was shown to be false, it got rebranded into naturalism, which is all that exists is, it's not well defined, it's nature. So, like, everything kind of, sort of, it's as I said, just poorly defined. To some degree, it's like everything that is in a hypothetically complete physics textbook, plus or minus, is what naturalism would be. And that more or less is what you find the typical Western atheist to hold. So, I may use the terms interchangeably, or in any event, you may well have heard of this under those different terms. This is not, by the way, a new idea. Here I have Volume 1 of the Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas from the 1100s, if memory serves. I knew at one point exactly when, and apologize my memory's failing me, but the Middle Ages. Okay, so in the third article, this is on the existence of God, whether God exists. If you're not familiar, St. Thomas would always put things in the form of arguments against his position, and on the contrary, and which explains the position and then answers to it. So here is St. Thomas arguing for the non-existence of God. It is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many, but it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason, or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. Okay, going to get to the answer shortly. By the way, fun fact, you'll notice that St. Thomas reduces everything to two principles, nature and will, or nature and reason. Now, whereas the modern atheist doesn't. Why the discrepancy? Well, it's very simple. The modern atheist doesn't actually believe that human beings have a reason or will. They'll talk about the word reason a lot, but they don't mean the same thing as what people have normally meant by reason. It's kind of got a long philosophical history to it. But suffice to say, basically, Kant killed off the concept of knowledge and replaced it with knowledge. And so he likewise sort of killed off the concept of reason and replaced it with reason. And it's that latter thing with scare quotes around it, where they just dropped the scare quotes essentially for convenience. I don't mean to say Kant literally put in scare quotes, by the way. I'm giving a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek but highly accurate summary of what happened. Likewise, because reason and will are intrinsically bound up. You can't have one without the other, because the will can only move towards what is apprehended by the intellect, but the intellect can only apprehend things by an action of the will. So it's a little bit complicated to describe, though it's something that we all experience every day, or at least I presume we all experience it. I mean, for all I know, some atheists are essentially like automatons that only look externally as if they were intelligent, sort of in the manner of if you train a dog to like press a series of buttons, doesn't know what it's doing, So I suppose in a technical sense that could be possible, and maybe the people who tell us that that nobody has any free will are telling us that because they don't have free will. I doubt it, though. Anyway, so presuming everybody has this experience, it's just a little bit difficult to describe. Okay, but atheists deny this. They very clearly will generally deny that we have free will. That intrinsically denies that we're actually capable of reasoning. Because, of course, reasoning can only come to a true conclusion if it is free to follow the truth, if it is predetermined to come to some other conclusion, not based upon the truth which it perceives, but upon simply initial conditions of the universe, or whatever. I'll get to this. I actually need to make a video about this, about how determinists are usually determinists at the wrong level. In theory, it should be, initial conditions of the universe etc. There's some asterisks, but predetermine everything that happened. And if not that, a random number generator that makes quantum mechanical stuff come out the way that it does, whatever. Anyway, but the point is they should be at that level, but they always actually talk at the level of like instinct, which is itself an epiphenomena of the subatomic stuff. And it's telling and interesting that they always get it wrong. But in any event, they, ignoring that for the moment, that they always get this wrong, and sort of ignoring the sort of determinism that they normally talk about in favor of the sort of determinism which, in theory, they should be talking about based upon what they claim is actually true. If your reason is predetermined based upon the movement of subatomic particles to come out to a particular conclusion, regardless of truth, you don't actually have reason in the classical sense of it. Reason is not something which knows truth or follows truth or can get at truth, etc. And this is intrinsically bound up to not having a will. So, given that atheists all deny this, they don't need to explain the voluntary aspect of the world because they don't believe it actually exists. So they deny that part and only have that one principle, reason. So, this is the false simplicity of atheism. That one principle which is nature. Ugh, knowing that I screwed that up. Anyway, this is the false simplicity of atheism or naturalism or materialism. It's that it claims that it's only got this one principle that explains everything. But the problem is, it doesn't explain everything. And it doesn't explain everything for the simple reason that a contingent thing intrinsically cannot fully describe itself. Now, I can all but hear the screeching of the people saying, aha, but you haven't proved the universe is contingent. This is trivially easy to prove that there are contingent things, and a thing made up of contingent things can't itself be necessary. It's what essentially always happens in this circumstance, because you can get into it and get into the back and forths, and the back and forths always consist of essentially people saying some version of no, or I won't believe it, or reason doesn't work. There's always some version of that. Okay. But the thing is, a contingent thing cannot explain itself because it is contingent. There is a portion of itself that intrinsically comes from outside of itself. And so, I mean, and you can kind of see this really by analogy, because I know there are just so stories to explain this within, the atheists like, but the so-called fine-tuning argument, why does an electron have the charge that it does relative to the mass that it does, relative to the strength of gravity, the force of gravity, and why does gravity go through things but charge doesn't, and why does charge, why is there positive and negative charge but only positive gravity, within the observed world, that you will find, by the way, as an asterisk, all sorts of things that people have to point to of, but there's this hypothetical model in which there's actually negative gravity, and so there is negative gravity as well as positive gravity, and we have the symmetry that we like. No one observes it, of course. It's not actually a thing. But anyway, so for anything, you will always see, and it kind of complicates all discussions, which is why I'm going to, for the most part, just ignore it going forward. But for every statement anybody can make about anything, you will always find somebody who has come up with some sort of contradictory somewhere about it. There's some sort of, completely untested theory with zero proof, wherein, that problem has magically gone away because I, came up with a theory where it doesn't have that problem. That's not what anybody observes. There's no reason to believe in this, but, technically for everything there's that asterisk. Okay, moving on. So the false simplicity of this is very simply that incidentally, the world is obviously contingent in that there was the Big Bang. The world got started, and I'm not even going to get into the people who will try to claim that the universe is actually, never actually got started. Because again, this is just a desperate attempt to evade what they don't want to deal with, and so they throw up a mess of essentially pure nonsense. And if you make the pure nonsense seem a little bit sensical, then I can stave it off. But you can do this about literally anything. It's a universal defeater to just spout nonsense that is carefully constructed to sound kind of like sense, and eventually wear people down to where they don't have time to time and energy to get through it. So, ignoring the people who don't believe that the universe started in the Big Bang, or that the universe actually has an age measured of approximately, I can't remember the most recent ones, 12 point something billion years? Somewhere between about 11 and 14 billion years. Estimates vary, and I haven't kept up with the most recent estimates. But anyway, they're all somewhere in that range. And so they're the people who deny that, nope, the universe is infinitely old. Whatever. So if the universe has a certain age, it started, and is therefore contingent, because the things that start are contingent. It's intrinsic in the nature of them, that if they started, then something started them. They didn't start themselves because they cannot have started themselves. They can't have started themselves because they weren't there to do it, very simply. Okay. So the bigger problem that comes in here, though, is that this is entirely intrinsic to it. So the simplicity here, and I get to this, by the way, I've also got a video called Occam's Razor Cuts Both Ways, where I talk about this very thing, that all attempts to simplify in this sort of sense are always some version of, there's some complexity I don't count, there's some complexity I do, and I'm simplifying only the complexity that I'm counting and not the complexity that I'm not. But, so here's the thing. There are all sorts of issues with nature as, like the laws of physics being a complete explanation for everything. One of the simplest being that it's plural. That you notice that the S, the laws of nature. I'm not going to address the idiots who will object to this right now. Sorry, I keep interrupting myself. So they're the laws of nature, plural. So there is the question then of, well, why are there multiple laws, and what puts them together? Why are there laws of nature at all? And the fine-tuning argument, which I brought up before, also goes to show this, that there are all of these things that are... this is not, by the way, the fine-tuning argument is not dispositive in the sense of, it is in the same sense that if you see a painting, a carefully constructed painting, it is always possible that, like, a bunch of paint, squirrels stepped on something, a bunch of paints flew up, and just happened to land in the form of this carefully constructed picture, complete with brushstrokes and whatnot. Technically, yeah, it could always happen. So it's not a proof in the sense of producing logical necessity, so I want to point that out. But it does illustrate the point that in the fine-tuning argument, why are all of these things the way that they are? And physics itself does not give an explanation for these things. Why do they have the various particular relationships that they do when they could have anything from the infinite range of possible relationships of the relative force of gravity and the electrostatic force, for example? There's nothing that, at least that anyone can see, that is intrinsic, that makes the one force so much weaker than the other force, but in exactly that proportionate way and not in some other proportion. And so you can see that these things happen. You can see that there's gravity, which is all positive, and there's charge, which is both positive and negative, and that charge is so wildly stronger than gravity, and and that it has these properties to it. And once you know these properties, there's an awful lot that they explain. You can go into all the many marvels of chemistry and produce explanations for why, with the various atoms and their binding forces and their relative masses and the shapes of the things that they create, etc., that there are these properties, then helps you to understand what the things which act according to their nature does. But what it doesn't do is tell you why they have this nature at all. Why is there this nature for them to have? Why do these things exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is that question, the famous question that puts that very succinctly. And so this is the fake simplicity of nature. It brushes all of these other questions sort of under the rug, and then, resolutely turns away and pretends that there's no rug. Which, is possible because it's an action of the will, and the intellect can only look at what the will permits it to look at, to return to a previous subject slightly. So there is that, it is a thing that human beings can do. They can turn away from the truth. They can just refuse to ask certain questions. And of course, one of the things is that people who refuse to ask questions tend to try to dignify this failure to be a proper human being. Because a proper human being is interested in knowledge, it wants to understand what there is around it, and they are failing to do that. They're not doing what they should be doing here, and so they will, by virtue of being ashamed of that on some level, try to justify it, say like, oh, it's hubristic to ask those questions. Human reason was not built to answer these sorts of questions. Of course, the problem is once they deny you can't deny reason a little bit. You can't deny reason on Thursdays. Logic doesn't work on Tuesdays is not a viable strategy. In the same way, like, logic works most of the places, but it doesn't work in France. If you go to France, logic stops working. Not people can't think logically in France. Like, a person who thinks logically, once they, like, cross that border, the logic ceases to work, but if they take a step back, now the logic works again. You can't do that. Which is what they're attempting to do anytime they tell you that, like, if you try to reason about any of the whys behind these things, why do these contingent things exist? Why do these things have the relationships that they have? Why are there all these subatomic particles that occupy the same space? I mean, this is one of those, it doesn't come up as often, like, as people don't use it rhetorically as much, but one of the big questions of contingency is, okay, so suppose you had electrons, multiple electrons, that all had this electron nature. So, because it's not like the laws of nature are like there's an electron here and he, like, checks against the stuff that's written on a list to figure out what he's allowed to do or not allowed to do. It's, that has a nature, fine, but why is the electron in space? Why are the two electrons in the same space? And again, there are people who object that actually, well, they're not really distinct particles, they're just concentrations of energy within a field. It doesn't really, I mean, you can kind of smooth away the problem of the multiple electrons in that sort of way, as long as saying that there really aren't multiple electrons. There's one energy field with concentrations that vary throughout space, although you kind of get the same problem as to why, because, like, one place is not the same as another place. They're obviously different from each other. They're obviously distinct from each other. And so you don't really escape the problem. You just make the problem harder to talk about. You still get the same problem of, like, why is there a gravitational field and why is there an electrical field? And that sort of, the field abstractions of it really are kind of problematic, though, in that, like, why should, because an electron is really, even if you want to talk about it in that field sort of way, it's the confluence of several fields all in one place that, oddly enough, well, to the degree that an electron is in one place. Again, asterisks here. But nonetheless, in a lot of cases, it at least sure acts like these things are all in one place and they all stick together for some reason, despite mass and charge not being like each other really at all. So these unlike things, why are they combined with each other? Why is space combined with space? Why is there... Because space is not one thing in the sense of being unified. Because the thing can be in one place and not in another place. And so these places are not actually the same thing with the same properties. They're not unified in that sense. So again, you have that problem of why is there space in that sense, and why is it the same space? Why is it what's in one place can interact with what's in another place? What puts them into the same universe? And as I said, people try to get around this by some version of essentially saying, well, there isn't actually more than one thing, but at some point, there becomes the problem that when somebody is willing to deny all of human experience in order to get around something, at some point you kind of need to just stop taking it seriously. That if a person is willing to deny everything, I experience free will, but I deny it. And I experience knowing things, but I deny it. And I experience multiple things, but nope, there's only one thing. At some point, the fact that they're denying literally all of human experience kind of tells you this is motivated reasoning. They're not... The theory behind theory... The idea is you're just starting from, like, what is the basics of what do you know? And the only thing we really know, so goes modern with a capital M philosophy, is our experiences. But the problem is they're denying all human experience. They're denying the reality of all human experience in order to get to things that are utterly removed from human experience. So if you're using human experience to try to establish the existence of things like electrons, and then using weird theories about electrons to say that all human experience is completely and utterly wrong, something is going on that isn't the person operating in a logical, rational manner. And at some point when a person is simply ceasing to be rational at all, at some point you kind of just have to say, like, okay, let me know if you get better, and we can have an actual conversation. Because you can constantly, there's no end to this. If you're willing to deny basic human experience, then you can hold to anything. I mean, trivially, easily, you can hold to anything. You can produce any theory and hold to it and just say that, like, why does basic human experience contradict it? Well, basic human experience is false. Don't believe it. Believe my theory instead. And you can do that about anything. And there's no limit to it. And there's nothing against which you're checking it. And there's nothing to moor you to reality as you do this. And so since it can go anywhere and do anything, it's kind of like the opposite of a universal defeater. A universal defeater, like just saying that, like, knowledge is impossible. Well, it'll defeat literally any argument. And, like, this is the opposite. This will support literally any argument. If you're willing to contradict basic human experience, then the sky's the limit in terms of what you want to conclude, and you will conclude whatever you want to conclude, because a person who uses this sort of universal prover is going to arrive wherever he wants to, not where he doesn't want to. As I said, it's motivated reasoning, and there isn't really a conversation to be had with motivated reasoning. So here's the thing. If you're trying to help somebody else who is committed to this idea, then this probably is not the way to do it, because they didn't get here by a system of reasoning. And if you are trying to grapple with but isn't this simpler, and shouldn't we believe the simpler thing, and so on, well, you should believe the correct thing, not the simpler thing. Simpler things are not always correct, for one thing. You just need a little bit of real experience about the world to show you that. There have been all sorts of theories that are beautifully simple and just wrong. So it's not actually like a useful heuristic. There are things where you should prefer simpler models, because roughly speaking, simpler models make more uniform predictions such that you can then verify their predictions over sort of like in the limits and in at least various points. And because the model is simple, you won't be particularly surprised in between the points you can verify. And so if you were constructing a model for some purpose, like if you want to know how a train will like be blown over in the wind, you want to construct a fairly simple model of this, because the simple model will be easy to use, and when you check it experimentally, you don't need to check nearly as many points, because there really aren't terms that can surprise you. The fewer variables you have written down in the equation, the easier it is to understand the equation, the easier it is to check it and make sure, like, okay, this produces results to within this error tolerance in the places we're going to apply it, and therefore it is a useful model for the particular purpose we're going to use it. That's where simplicity is actually useful. That's where simplicity is actually a very good heuristic. If you are making a model for a purpose to do a specific piece of technology, whether you're building a bridge or a model airplane or whatever, you always want the simplest model you can find there, both because one, it's way easier to work with, although in the computer age it's not so bad, but two, because models are as the saying goes, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Once you construct your model, you have to check it. But there are an infinite number of points you could check, and so if your model has a lot of terms that can blow up and surprise you, like your model for a bridge, for example, includes things like resonance frequencies of the wind, they might blow up on occasion, and suddenly there's like enormous forces operating in your bridge that will tear it to pieces. And well, actually, it's not the best example, because that really happened. If you look up the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, in which they had a model that was nice and simple and didn't take into account things like wind resonances, and the wind resonances actually caused the bridge to, because it produced, was it standing waves? I forget. Anyway, the waves got reinforced. There may have been a standing wave with the air, something like that. I forget exactly. But the bridge had essentially a harmonic frequency that would with a appropriately tuned crosswind, which could get produced in the Tacoma Narrows, made the bridge move so much it eventually tore itself apart and fell down. So that was not the best place to have a simple model, in fact. Yeah, but anyway, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge aside, and other places where overly simple models have gone wrong, simple models frequently are the ones that you want, as long as you have simplified correctly and not incorrectly. A little bit analogous to, I think it was supposedly Garry Kasparov, I don't know, some famous chess player, was asked, how many moves ahead do you think? And he replied, 1, but it's the right move. So, yeah, when you're simplifying, you want the simplest possible model that doesn't leave out anything that's actually relevant to what you're doing. Good luck. Point being, that's where that heuristic actually comes from. Because when you check it, having things that won't, terms in it that may not, suddenly become very important, is really useful to being able to check the model against things that, okay, yep, works in these various places, so anywhere in between these two ends, I can apply the model and I should be fine. That's not what most of anyone is doing in most of life. And even the Tacoma Narrows Bridge kind of shows you the limitations of that. So, simplicity. It is not really desirable, except if you happen to be doing certain sorts of modeling activities. It is not really a heuristic for describing much of life. It is also very easy to fool yourself about how simple things are, and is often gotten at the expense of just ignoring whatever you don't want to pay attention to. And so the fact that you will find people who will tell you that you should prefer simpler things and that their thing is simpler as long as you ignore the stuff that they tell you should be ignoring, it's not a really good argument. It really isn't a good argument at all. Because if you actually boil it down, really pay attention to what they're saying and work it out carefully, because if this is troubling you, that's the only way that's going to help. So, don't take my generalization, don't take my word for it in my generalization. Pay attention, think through very carefully what they're saying, and what you will discover is that it is some form of, don't worry, ignore the stuff that I don't want to pay attention to, because I don't think anyone should pay attention to that, because I don't want to think about that. And instead, only focus on this stuff. And if you do that, you'll be in complete conformity to what they want you to pay attention to. And it's not really worth anything. And if you really think it through, pay attention, work this all out, you will find that's what they're actually saying. And, So, if you want to go and be their mind slave for some reason, go ahead. That's a great way to achieve that very thing. But if that's not your goal, then think it through. You'll find out that's what they're actually saying. And then move on with your life. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.